awkward few seconds. I believe we are all live, guys. So, hey, thank you very much for joining me in. And first and foremost, Darren, thank you so much for being generous with your time and sharing it with me and my audience.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, guys. If you're just tuning in, let me just give you a few words about why I'm so excited about this conversation with Darren and why he's such a great guest for all of us today. Now, Darren is well ahead of the curve when it comes to remote leadership and remote working model. His book was released in 2015, which is years before the whole world was forced into embracing remote. Actually, wow, learning it almost from the scratch for many of us. Darren has been in this field for many years, and he is a leading voice in that area. Today, he's a head of remote at GitLab with 1,500 employees from 60 plus countries, which is, to me, it's insane. That is a definition of remote working place, guys. So you will learn why Darren is a leading voice and how innovative he is in his approach, guys. And I can't wait to dive into it. Darren, as I'm preparing for those interviews, I always love doing it because I'm learning something before the conversation takes place. But there's one thing that I've learned about you, which is unique and different. What I've learned is that it takes about 17,000 blog posts to put your name into Guinness book. And that's what you've done, which is extraordinary. Such a commitment. Wow. I'm wondering, where does this passion commitment comes from for you to be such an avid writer and put it all the time and effort into it and sharing it with the world?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. So I am in the Guinness Book of World Records. I'm the planet's most prolific professional blogger. So Ralph mentioned it, but around 17,000 posts over the course of 4 years, which breaks down to an article published every 2 hours, 24/7, 365 for 4 consecutive years, which is kind of maddening to think about now. I kind of fell
Yes,
into
when you say it out loud.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. I post every 2 hours for 4 straight years, and I actually kept writing after that. And so now we're up to, I think at the time that was around 6 million words. I think it's 10 or 12 million now, and the record still stands. So that's pretty incredible. I fell in love with storytelling a bit by accident. My education background is in logistics and supply chain management. I have an MBA. But I stumbled upon this website called Engadget, and I fell in love with technology. I just thought the way they told stories was so fascinating. And it's one of those things that I got really fortunate to discover that publication as it was growing. I joined the site, stayed there almost 8 years, became its managing editor, and hired a lot of the people who now have ran it and have stewarded it. And you just know when you fall into something that feels like a passion, it feels like a calling, it just feels different. And for me, strategic communications and storytelling was that area. The remote part of it was very interesting because I found out early on, to hire the world's best talent all over the world, I needed to look far and wide. And so we had editors and writers in 6 continents. And it was incredible what we were pioneering in the remote space far before COVID put it on everyone's radar.
Wow, so it sounds like early on you had to adapt and learn, and you had almost more time to figure it out. What are the best practices, right, for hiring and onboarding? So what were your early lessons when it comes to hiring and onboarding people when it comes to remote?
Yeah, the earliest lesson that is seared into my mind is that documentation is the key to scaling knowledge. And what happened early on is I was hiring and training editors day after day. And I began to realize that many of them had the exact same questions day after day. And I realized that as I was going through this onboarding process and doing it very manually, very intense one-on-one, I thought, if people are asking the same questions, maybe I should just write it down once and then share it a limitless amount of time. It's a very simple idea, but we went full on into that. And so we established a wiki. Now we would use the term knowledge base or company handbook or operating manual, but years ago, it was a simple wiki where whenever someone would ask me a question in onboarding, I would document the answer. And then for every new hire that would come after that person, I would send them this Wikipedia page on their start date and say, read, read, read. Before you ask a question, search for it, build that muscle of self-service, build that anticipation of my question is already answered. I just need to search for it. And that was a huge early learning that allowed us to hire and train rapidly and accelerate our growth and scale our knowledge in a really powerful way.
As I was researching into GitLab and what you guys doing, it seems like now it becomes one of the main approach and methodology in which you guys operating with, right?
Absolutely. So fast forward to where I am now as the head of remote at GitLab. GitLab is an incredibly transparent company, and the GitLab handbook, it's world famous now. It is public to the world. And so if I were to ask you about the GitLab values, you would be just as equipped to answer it as I would. It's not like it's an internal company repository. If you Google GitLab values, you'll find the same page that all of our team members have. And I thought this was such a fascinating approach to making knowledge public, because it keeps you accountable to making sure that you're writing down how it is that you work every day and how you interact with people. You mentioned this earlier, but we're in more than 60 countries. And realistically, the only way to scale knowledge across that many time zones and to break the stranglehold of synchronicity is to rigorously document how it is that you work and what your values are, how you treat each other. So as much information as possible is searchable and is findable by as many people as possible without needing anyone else to be online at a particular time, or without needing to be in the exact same time zone as someone else.
Yeah, the Readme section, and this is something that I encourage you guys listening right now, connect with Darren and check out his Readme page. Now, I could actually glimpse from you, I bounced into other employees within your brand to learn more about them as well, which I really love that idea, so much so that I'm going to write my own version of it. But it allows me to learn so much about yourself. And in your email, you've mentioned to me, well-written Readme really cut 6 to 12 months of getting to know each other. And as soon as I seen the 6 to 12 months, literally my reaction was, really? And I thought, actually, yeah. Well-written one really overcomes so many obstacles when it comes to get to know each other, and therefore the whole leadership and work and the way of navigating and engaging with each other is a lot more easier. Is that what you also guys finding at GitLab?
Absolutely. And so for those who are not familiar with this term, a personal Readme is essentially an operating manual for a person written by that person. And I had never really heard of these until I joined GitLab, and I realized that GitLab CEO has one. If you look in the handbook at the CEO page, you'll find that Sid, the CEO of GitLab, has this Readme. Things like communication preferences, idiosyncrasies, known faults or flaws that he is actively working on, things that he has been told by other people, but he doesn't readily recognize. He was documenting all of this in such a vulnerable and transparent way. And I thought, by the time I read it all, it was as if I had worked with the CEO for 1 or 2 years, even though we had not yet been on a project yet. And I immediately saw the power in that. And as a writer, of course, writing things comes naturally to me. And I realize that that's not the case for everyone, but I would encourage you to check out my Readme, check out other Readmes, look at them and think about what would one look like for you, especially if you're a manager. This is a massive superpower. If you document what it is to work with you, it enables anyone that works with you, your direct reports, people on a collaborative cross-functional team, people outside of your company, to digest in 5 to 10 minutes what it would otherwise take 6 to 12 months to learn about you through rigorous working together. Things like how you prefer to be communicated with. Do you prefer synchronous or asynchronous? What are your known idiosyncrasies? It requires a lot of vulnerability to write these things down, and you have to be very open to asking for feedback from others and then documenting it. But I think it's really, really powerful, and I've received a lot of great feedback on putting that out there.
It is. In fact, I'll have some feedback for you later on as well on the back of it. But what jumped out from me from this Readme, and what you also mentioned about your CEO, how he wrote about the flaws that he's working on. Now, for me, as a feedback coach, this is where I'm really geeking out here now, because one of the reasons why managers, especially the higher you go, don't get the feedback that you want, they still want to grow, but there is not enough feedback. Huge reason for behind that is because people don't know what you're working on, and giving feedback up is already taking a risk as it is.
Right.
And then adding another risk of it, I'm not sure if it's relevant to that person.
Right.
Then, combining the two, I'd rather stay safe and stay quiet. But if I know that you're exactly working on storytelling, or you're working on that, or your listening skills, and this is my flow that I'm working on, then if I go to the meeting and I've got in my head, I'm thinking, oh,
yeah,
Darren is working on that one thing, and I noticed something that is so relevant to him. So I'm going to let him know because he cares about it, and he's been vulnerable enough to share with us what is it, the one thing that he works on right now. And so even from that perspective, it's such a great tool to build those coaching relationship between employees and managers, and in all really directions.
And I'll give you a great example of that. I write in my Readme that I will generally be silent and assume that everything is okay until you tell me otherwise. And this is a really powerful thing for other people to know, because some people thrive with constant feedback, positive, negative, neutral. They just constantly want a pulse. I generally don't work that way. If I think everything is going fine and I look at the metrics and things are going fine, I generally won't step into that. I serve as more as an unblocker. Come to me and I'll help you unblock. But it's really, really useful to know things like that as you work with people, so that you don't make incorrect assumptions about how they like to operate or what they're thinking when you're working with them.
Yeah, it is incredible, because I'm that person who thrives on feedback. I'm a growth savvy person. So if you stayed quiet, I may assume that you're not taking care about my growth, but knowing it, now the ball is in my court, and I know how I need to respond in order to get what I need. Love it. I absolutely love it. But you've mentioned the word unblocker as a manager, and this is something I came across again as I was researching for this episode. Could you just break it down a little bit further? What does it mean to be unblocker as a manager?
Yeah. So the classic definition would be servant leader. And so you're someone who wants to serve the people who report to you and empower them and elevate them. But in a remote setting, I love to use the term unblocker because it's more of a verb. It is a term that you can see action in. So here's the example. A lot of people in a co-located setting are more directors. They'll manage by walking around. They'll go to someone's desk. They'll tap them on the shoulder and they'll say, hey, make sure this happens by the end of the day or the end of the week. When you're managing a distributed team and you have people all over the world, it's a lot more impractical, let's say. But I also think it sets remote managers up to be unblockers, which I think is far more impactful and efficient. Essentially, you proactively create a sense of psychological safety for your direct reports. And you say, my goal is to make you the best that you can be and help you run as fast as you possibly can. And so whenever anything trips you up, come to me with context of what is blocking you. And it will be my goal to unblock you as fast as possible, so that you can then continue running as fast as you can. There's a book called High Output Management, and there's a concept in there of managerial leverage. Essentially, it says that managers are graded by how much leverage they can create through their direct reports. It is no longer about what they themselves do as an individual contributor, but you're measured on how much can your team do? How much leverage can you create? And if you're an active unblocker, you can create massive amounts of leverage because you get things out of the way of people who are really ambitious and passionate about solving great problems. And so that is why I love the term unblocker. It invites feedback. It invites complexity. It invites circumstances to come to you. And that's really powerful if you can create that atmosphere where people are comfortable bringing that feedback to you.
Okay. Yeah. So far, I'm already gathering that within the remote working environment, you're putting a lot of, or you passing the responsibility a lot on your employees for them to take the ownership, for them to take the steps. And I can only imagine, I never worked remotely as a manager. I can only imagine, because you know what's going on your end. I don't. And as you mentioned, I no longer can walk around the office and tap in the shoulder and see. So therefore, you have the context, you have the knowledge. I am literally on the completely different end of the world right now. See, I'm in the UK, you're in the States. I have no idea to a great degree what you're doing. So
Right.
responsibility needs to be shifted more towards employees, right?
Correct. And there is a two-part system that really enables this to be very powerful in great remote teams. First is this leadership principle that we call manager of one. And so if you, of course, Google this, you will find it in the GitLab handbook, but there are over 15 different elements that make up a manager of one. Essentially, everyone at GitLab treats themselves as a manager of one. They're a manager of their own time, a manager of their own attention, and a manager of their own path to accomplish the mutually agreed upon objectives and key results for any given quarter. Now, of course, what else comes with that as a manager of one is that you are also responsible of properly adding context and feedback and escalating issues to the right people so that they can unblock you. This is part of that process. So that's step one. The prerequisite is step two, which arguably comes before, which is appropriate documentation that enables you to be an amazing manager of one.
Right.
What you'll find in most co-located organizations is that very little is written down. And so the only way to pass along knowledge or the only way to unblock someone is to get their physical time. And then you end up in this terrible loop of synchronous meetings and fighting for time on people's calendars.
Yeah.
And people end up stuck for days just because they can't get your attention. This is a massive amount of inefficiency. And so by documenting what your team is doing, what your goals and objectives are, you empower each person to look at documentation instead of looking to people to get on the right track. For example, every team's OKRs, objectives and key results at GitLab, are public to every other team. So marketing can see what engineering is working on this quarter, and engineering can see what communications is working on this quarter. By providing that fundamental foundational transparency, documenting what people are working on, you empower people to move much further, much faster, and also give more context when they do come along with feedback.
And there is also something that is obvious, but it also reduces the stress and pressure on you. And literally last week, I spoke with a person who moved from mid-sized company to a large company. A lot of it now is done remotely as well. And he said to me, Raf, my manager, for the first time, I'm working on such a huge project myself. And now my manager also left. And I'm here thinking so many questions that I can't even answer. I can't reach that person. And I'm sitting listening to him, and I'm saying, you want to come and listen to this interview because I know that GitLab solved it in such a way that you wouldn't have to sit being stressed and overwhelmed, which then has a domino effect on everything else around. So just with that quick example that he gave me, I've realized how powerful tool it is for you guys. But you've mentioned not many companies are documenting things. What stops people from documenting every single part of the process and create this huge database, if you will?
Documentation is one of these things that has outsized effects if done early. It's the same concept of compounding interest. If you put something in early and just resist the urge to break the compounding, then you'll have massive residual effects of that years later. But on the other side of that, if you don't set up a foundation of documentation, it is really, really, really difficult to establish mainstream. And I think that's what's really rocking the worlds of so many companies right now. As they have moved into a distributed or remote space, they're recognizing that sustaining their business by nonstop wall-to-wall video calls is not going to work in the long term. And I think a lot of them know that the answer is a hard, clean break from the way things used to be done. By the way, the most dangerous words in business are, we've always done it that way. And I think a lot of leaders know this, but creating the space for that clean break and creating that line in the sand and say, this is our new way forward. We are going to invest in knowledge management. We are going to invest in a person or a team who will wrangle this, and they will start adding taxonomy and codification to how we work. It's a big thing to swallow. And I have seen some teams take the leap and say, we're going to start investing now. It's not clean. It doesn't happen overnight. It's an iterative process. But for a lot of companies, it's daunting to think of,
Yeah.
how do we create a documentation culture now if we never had one in the past?
Mm. And perhaps even it sounds like it's another thing to do and I'm already so busy. Well, you're busy finding the answers in the first place, so at least make it easier for you for the next gen that joins you, right?
A lot of this is a mental model shift.
Yeah.
People will oftentimes tell me that if they do a 25 or 30-minute meeting, pausing after the meeting to write down the takeaways so that it benefits more than the people in the meeting is time consuming. It's inefficient. But I would argue that it's only inefficient if your time scales are in 30-minute chunks. If
Mm-hmm.
you zoom out just a bit and recognize a time scale of a week or a month or a year, pausing for a moment to document a key takeaway could save you 1, 2, 10, 100 meetings over a long enough time period. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
actually much more efficient to write it down than
Mm-hmm.
to not. And especially if you scale this across the entire organization, you can quickly see how much more efficient it could
Yeah.
be. But here's the thing, this cannot be a bottoms up, grassroots type of movement. This has to be a top down, executive sponsored type of behavioral shift where you aren't just paying lip service to documentation. You are saying, this is our new way of working. I
Right.
actually don't prefer the term documentation. At GitLab, we use the term handbook first. We want to
Handbook
work
first.
handbook first, not synchronous first or tap this person on the shoulder first, but handbook first. And the reason for that is if you allow each team to document in their own way, in their own tool, using their
Mm-hmm.
own taxonomy, it's chaotic. It's difficult for each team to understand what each team is doing. But if you have a handbook across the organization, there's a usage guide, there's some baseline expectations on this is how we organize information. Information is so powerful, but it's useless if it's not documented and findable. And the last thing I'll mention on this is I will get people that say, wow, the GitLab handbook is 2,000 pages. Isn't that a bit much? And to that, I respond, we don't ask everyone who's onboarding to read all 2,000 pages. We simply teach them how to find what they need when they
Yeah.
need it. If I were to ask you, is there too much information on the internet? You would say, no, I understand how to search for what I need when I need it. And a lot of this that we've learned on how to search for things on the internet could be ported into the organization, but it does require executive sponsorship to make sure that it's embraced across the company.
I can imagine, or I suspect that overwhelming sense of why 2,000 pages handbook comes with the old school mentality that if it's handbook, I need to read it, desk to desk. It's not what exactly it is, which is great. And there's also something else that is beautiful to me within your process. Now, not so long ago, I spent a week in a tech company, and they have this wonderful tool to share the feedback. And they have this huge screen when those comments are just popping out. So every morning I started with a tea and reading those comments.
Yeah.
Now, my purpose behind it wasn't necessarily only to see what the great things that people are doing. What I was doing is trying to understand the behaviors and focus points, how people communicate, what they accentuate and focus on, because that is a passive feedback to me as a coach, as a manager. Yeah. And so when you said someone's writing down the minutes after the meeting, to me also what it is, it tells me what are you paying attention to, priority to, what is your communication style and language, where do you emphasize things? So that helps me also build a certain profile and understanding of you as an individual. Because if I was writing those minutes, I'm guessing that the focus points or certain things would be different to you and someone else as well. So for me, it's also a great passive feedback to learn more about your employees and your managers within the business.
Not to mention, if you really embrace this, feedback is everywhere because the handbook is changeable by anyone in the company, and it changes numerous times per day as new things happen and new approaches are taken. And so at GitLab, we use the GitLab platform to iterate on our handbook, and you'll see hundreds of proposals every single day with people giving feedback on, hey, this section needs to be updated, or this is no longer relevant, or I'm inserting a new link here for this new
Right.
module that we're using. It is really, really powerful, and it allows you to digest that feedback and see how people give feedback and where they give feedback and where it comes from. It's a lot less chaotic. It's a lot more digestible.
Do you have someone specifically who moderates your handbook, or is it like a Wikipedia, anyone can jump in and write and it just stays there?
So we started this early on by creating a usage guide at the executive level. And then we onboarded each person to be responsible for their own function. So it's functionally organized. In other words, the finance section of the handbook is organized and maintained by the finance section of the organization. So there is some leeway for each organization to go about their handbook section in their own unique way, but there's also some basic foundational principles. For example, English is our business language. And so every section in the handbook will be written in English, even if English isn't your first language. So there's a nice balance there of some foundational usage principles. So you generally have a guide of how to organize information, but still some freedom for each function to make it their own so that it really serves their key people.
I can already see how you guys are being so innovative and different with your approach, including the head of remote. Now, again, I'm not a tech person, and I haven't heard and met many head of remotes. Is it a relatively new position? And if yes, should everyone make it happen? I can see for brands like yours of the size of GitLab, it makes sense, but some brands are hybrids. Some brands are just 100 people in, 150. Would it make sense also for them to hire someone like yourself?
To my knowledge, I'm the world's first head of remote. It will probably not surprise you that I have received this question before, and after answering it 2 or 3 times, it dawned on me that I should probably create a GitLab handbook page to go into more detail about the origins and the genesis of this role, as well as its evolution. But to answer your question directly, yes, it is becoming more popular. Facebook, Quora, VMware, a lot of these tech companies are hiring dedicated leaders to manage the behavior change around remote work. Now, not everyone uses the title head of remote. Some companies are calling it director of remote workforce solutions, things of that nature.
Right.
But it's a clear indicator that a company is serious about this transition. And if candidates are looking for great remote companies, walking into a company that has a dedicated leader to making sure that the remote or distributed experience is as good as anything that the company has offered before or better is a strong signal that employee experience is prioritized at the company. And a lot of organizations are realizing that if maybe they don't need a head of remote, but they need new talent and new ways of thinking to evolve their company into what is next. There is no putting this genie back in the bottle. Now that the world has had 2+ years of living and working in this way, it's not going to just snap back. So for example, a lot of organizations which are smaller, they may say, well, we're doing okay operationally right now. Maybe a head of remote is a bit of a stretch, but let's hire a knowledge manager. We have documentation, but it's not really well organized and there's not really a lot of process around it. Let's hire someone to make sure that that is the case. And so companies are going about it in different ways, but look for companies that are hiring leaders to make sure that the evolution of this goes well.
Yeah. Which perfectly segues what you just mentioned, segues to one of my questions that I plan to ask you. And that is, let's just pretend for a second that I'm actually looking into work for GitLab now. I've mentioned no experience to lead teams remotely, as I'm guessing a lot of people don't. And a lot of people are a lot more attracted now to work for brands like yourself and be fully remote. So my first question would be, how do you onboard and train someone like myself who has no experience as a manager working remotely?
There's a lot of reading involved, but the truth is we're very open about that. I like to say that no one accidentally ends up at GitLab. You can do research on working here and you see things like self-service and manager of one. And you can read a lot of this information and you recognize that you're going to need to be aligned to wanting to work and learn in that way. But we're also very specific in how we onboard people, and being cognizant of the fact that they may be coming from 20 or 30 years of co-located experience. And a lot of this will be brand new. And not only brand new, but sometimes in direct opposition to the way that they have been working for 30 years. I like this term, unlearning. Our friends over at Levels call it deprogramming, where you architect onboarding in a specific way that points out examples of the way things may have been done in the past. And then you give people explicit permission to do them differently at your company in a remote first way. Here's a simple but powerful example of this. We say that in a meeting, it's okay to look away. Now, in the past, you may have worked in an organization where if you were in an hour-long meeting and you weren't staring directly into the camera for the entire hour, people would assume that you were goofing off or being disrespectful or not paying attention to people who were speaking. But at GitLab, we want to explicitly say that you are the manager of your own time and attention. And so if only 10 minutes of the meeting are directly relevant to you, it's totally fine to still be in the meeting, but work on something else or check Facebook or call your spouse. It's your time. It's your ability to manage it. But it's powerful to say that, because otherwise you may need to work here for 6 or 9 months to kind of pick up via osmosis. Wow, people do things differently here. It's much easier and more efficient to just write it down
and just let people know. You already mentioned the old school ways of doing, because we've always been doing that way. And in my world as a feedback coach, there are so many formats that people just keep on trying and tweaking to improve feedback culture versus looking at it differently and say, hey, just park away how to give the feedback and actually look at it from a broader perspective, because we need to change that irrational relationship that we have with the feedback. And I can see that a lot of managers and employees would try to replicate what they've been doing in office and remotely. So if I was to join you, what would be the mistakes that are more likely to make transitioning from one environment to another, like specific mistakes? And if you could help me and others to avoid them, that would be phenomenal.
Specific mistake number one is defaulting to a meeting to move any piece of work forward. And so at GitLab, we have a bias for asynchronous communication. Now, that doesn't mean we never have meetings, but it means that we want to first think, can this work be done in a way that doesn't commandeer time from someone else? And only if through this flow chart you realize that the answer is no, then you go to a meeting. So it's simply changing the default, but it is a rewiring for a lot of people. Our bias for async is actually not within our results or efficiency value. It's actually within our diversity, inclusion, and belonging value. And a lot of people are puzzled by this. But the reason we put it there is that we believe moving toward asynchronous work is a signal of respect. If you take the initiative to move a piece of work forward without commandeering time from someone else, you are being more respectful of their time. And you can get a lot more buy-in on moving from synchronous to asynchronous by default if you frame the entire thing as a matter of respect. You're enabling people to live more flexible days and spend more time with their family and community instead of stuck in a meeting that didn't really need to be a meeting. So that's number one. Number two is GitLab's value of iteration. You've heard the word iteration before. Everyone thinks they understand iteration, but it is by far the most difficult value to practice. At GitLab, iteration truly means ship the smallest possible thing as early as possible to get the most feedback as possible while it is still useful, while you can still form and mold an idea. Many people will join a new organization and they will try to put together a perfectly polished project to really put their name and stamp their name on the organization. So they may join and spend 3, 6, 9 months kind of working over here in a silo quietly, only to launch this big thing 9 months later. But if you really practice iteration, you would just write the first paragraph down, the figment of the idea, and then with no ego and short toes and a low level of shame, share this openly with as many people as possible, ideally the entire organization, and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Does anyone want to contribute to help me make this better? Does anyone have feedback that could make this even better than I could possibly think of? That is a massive leap for most people,
Yeah.
because it's really putting yourself out there, number one, but also it's a massive leap of faith that when you are vulnerable and you share an early idea that isn't fully baked, that doesn't have a long-term plan, that it will be met with respect and celebration and iterative feedback instead of a negative reaction of, why didn't this person put more thought into it? It is a serious rewiring. And that's the second biggest thing that people really have aha moments or epiphanies when they join GitLab.
The second part, the iteration part, I can see myself doing that mistake, falling into it. But as you explain it, I can see the value of it. And the first thing that came to my mind was, well, if I don't put it out sooner, then I might be working on the wrong problem, solving the wrong problem, or solving it wrongly, and somebody else fix it or run across it already and could fast track my progress. So rather than me sitting in my own room, brainstorming all those ideas and thinking about them and filtering from my own experience, again, which will be biased, and then say, hey, this is a piece of work that I've done. And somebody goes, well, you haven't considered this, this, and that. And I'm like, it's 3 months of my work seems like I've done nothing or everything is wrong, versus putting a little bit of it, detaching ego from that process. I'm guessing that's the key here.
Exactly.
Help me focus on the right thing and solving the right problems that are relevant to everyone around, and also allows people to contribute to it.
Ralph, to put it more simply, iteration creates more leverage for feedback. The earlier you can get feedback, the more powerful it is, the less undoing you have to do, the less difficult it is to swallow. If you just put an idea out there and you get feedback on it, well, you haven't spent or invested enough time to be really invested into one train of thought. So you hear the feedback and think, great, I wasn't even thinking about the future anyway. Now I'm just pleased that someone is helping contribute to making this better. Conversely, if you wait 6 months to ask for feedback, it could be catastrophic because you have to undo potentially months of work. So the feedback is oftentimes not something you want to hear, because it will create a lot more work. And so putting stuff out there early and asking for feedback makes feedback more fun and creates a lot more leverage around it.
And you feel like you're progressing versus you've put the work out. Now the feedback is not necessarily what you wanted, and you may feel like you're a failure. Doesn't mean you are, but it just creates that sense and feeling. And perception is the king in that case, right?
Indeed.
The async ways of working, can I just pause for a little bit here and just explain to me how that work? And I get why we now need to do it, but I'm trying to imagine myself, how would I operate on a project that is async? And I found it very difficult I found it hard way setting up interview with somebody who was in Australia. I set up for 7 a.m. to make comfortable for the person, and I realized what the mistake I did for myself just with that one time zone. And so async, I can see it's going to help manage that challenge here. But how does it physically, tangibly look like? Where do I store the information, and maybe how long it's okay to wait for a piece of information and contribution? I'm not sure. It's so unique and different to me. That change seems to be scary and counterintuitive right now. So could you just walk me through?
Let's start with a definition. So asynchronous work is the art of moving a piece of work forward without someone else being awake or online at the exact same time. And a lot of people will pit asynchronous and synchronous against each other. They'll put a versus in between those two words.
Right.
But I actually see them as very complementary. They are two tools in a toolbox. And great remote workers know when and how to harness asynchronous work to catalyze great synchronous work. And so knowing when to use each is really, really powerful. So I'll give you 2 examples. First, let's actually start with this interview, a simple example. Now, for a lot of podcast hosts, they want to get to know the guest beforehand and maybe go over some questions to make sure that they're on the same page. And so how do you do this? Well, you have a prep call. You have asynchronous time where you
Mm-hmm.
get together, you meet the person, and you go over some questions. And there's nothing wrong with that. But consider the cost of this. We're
Mm-hmm.
in vastly different time zones. So it's going to be another call in addition to the actual podcast that is potentially disruptive to our schedules, to our
Yeah.
families. And it's the kind of thing that if we structure a shared document and you give me some context on what this podcast is generally about and what you generally like to ask people, I could then put some feedback on, well, I've never been asked this question and I think it would be really exciting. And you could say yes or no. And we could
Mm-hmm.
go back and forth on this shared document, a simple Google Doc or 365 doc. And if given enough time, we could create a really amazing script or a really amazing path forward on this without having that call.
Mm-hmm.
Now, directly related to GitLab, we use the GitLab platform because it is built for asynchronous communication. It's built for threaded conversations back and forth. So, for example, if a report of mine is working on a new white paper with a third-party client and a draft of that comes in, instead of scheduling a meeting with me to screen share that draft with me and get real-time feedback that I could verbalize back,
Mm-hmm.
the person could simply attach that document in a GitLab issue and then tag me in it and say, hey, here's the draft. We have one more revision to go. I would love to get your specific feedback on this by this day. And this
Mm-hmm.
solves the issue that you mentioned about how long is too long, or how long does this person have,
Yeah.
or, am I just leaving this person in the lurch? It really requires that person to set the context and set the guardrails so that I know the directive.
Mm-hmm.
If I read this and they're asleep, I hope they've given me all the instruction I need to then respond in kind. And where this really gets powerful is that if it is an open document, and so other people outside of our team could see us going back and forth with this feedback, someone from our design team, for example, may see this and also chime in and say, hey, in addition to Darren's feedback, I've seen as a best practice, if we remove this white space here, or maybe we should pull in a stat from this other paper that we're working on. I think it would be a perfect accompaniment right here. That is massively powerful. You would
Mm-hmm.
never get that in a synchronous meeting because it would be siloed. And so the wider you make the aperture, enabling people to give feedback, the better the product, the finished product can become.
Yeah, A, it's siloed, and B, it's not everyone feels courageous enough sometimes to voice their opinion, to chime in. But also some leaders are running the meetings in a way that they always speak first, and then they create this groupthink process when people kind of like, I had a different idea, but my senior manager already stated his opinion or her opinion, and I'll step back. So I love that process.
And I glossed over this a bit, but I do want to reiterate how important the tooling is. At GitLab, we're very blessed to make a tool that helps us work asynchronously. But if you're in a company that does not have the digital infrastructure to support this type of asynchronous work, you may be scratching your head and thinking, well, what combination of carrier pigeons and email can accomplish this? And the short answer is you can't. There are a lot of tools out there that help create a central workspace. Friday is a great one. Dropbox Spaces is a great one. Catalog with a Q, QATALOG. These are great tools that act as a central hallway where you can congregate around work and move it forward asynchronously.
Nice one. I can see how you guys evolving, growing, and constantly improving your ways of working. And I'm wondering if you had recently a situation when you went like, as a head of remote, thinking, wow, this is a challenge that I have no answers to. So let's just guys get into it so we can improve our remote ways of working. I'm curious to hear if you had the situation recently and how did you approach it? What were your questions that you're asking yourself?
An early one was, are we sharing enough about how we work remotely in onboarding? Are we confident that when people join the company, they can jump into work and work the way that we want them to work? And so we did an audit of our onboarding process, and we recognized that we should probably put together a dedicated module just to remote first ways of working. And so I worked with our learning and development team to build a remote work fundamentals course that is now a part of onboarding. So everyone that joins GitLab goes through this fundamentals course and they get a certification at the end.
Mm-hmm.
That has been really powerful to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Another step of that our L&D team is spearheading right now is making sure that managers are upskilled in a way that they are appropriately equipped to lead remote teams. So, for example, if you joined the company and you were an individual contributor and you took that fundamentals course and now you've evolved to being a people manager,
Mm-hmm.
there's an opportunity for re-onboarding or reskilling or upskilling. And so our manager training is what we're calling it through L&D. That's it's in, I think it's third iteration now. Everything is iterative at GitLab. So it's getting better all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Totally get it. Right. There's a question that comes to my mind. So there is no question whether the remote ways of working is great and whether it's a future. And a lot more people will be drawn into these ways of working. And well, let's just flip the coin. I've heard the term recently that perhaps 2022 will be, the year of reset, when actually everyone's jump on the remote ways of working now maybe actually isn't as great. And I'm curious to hear your objective opinion on that, whether it will or won't happen, or where the next few years you see the remote leadership and the hybrid companies moving around, how it would look like most likely in the next year or two.
So I'll give you a few predictions here. One is that really there's no such thing as hybrid work. Now, a lot of companies are saying hybrid is the future because it provides the most choice, but I actually don't think that term is the right one. A company is either going to be office first or remote first. There's no in between. So for example, when it comes to collaboration, is the default going to be, well, wait until you're in the office and then use this whiteboard here, which has no connection to the internet and therefore is not useful to anyone not in the office? Or is the company going to say, let's tear down these physical whiteboards. Let's invest in a tool like Miro or Mural or Figma, and let's convert our whiteboarding all to remote, all to digital first, so that even if you are in a physical office, you are using this digital tool. That is what I mean by there is no such thing as hybrid. A company is either going to decide one way or the other, and it will color how people experience the company. And so this is going to be the difference between remote being allowed or remote being supported. And I think the digital first, the virtual first, the remote first companies will have much more success, even if they keep an office or two open. At their core, they're going to be a virtual first organization. The fact that they have real estate is secondary in importance. And I think the other thing here is that increasingly work will become more and more asynchronous. As we get better with using the tools, like I just mentioned, people will start to realize that there's less and less need to have synchronous meetings. We've all heard that term, hey, I was in a meeting that could have been an email.
Yeah.
I think the next iteration of that is, hey, I was in a physical whiteboarding session that could have been virtual and digital. And instead of getting feedback from 8 people in a room, we could have had feedback from 800 people across a team. That is the future.
I'm really curious to see how it all works out. And I'm always trying to filter it through my own ways of working. Like I already mentioned, I never work remotely. And I was always curious, how will I lead and coach people? Because I've developed a lot of my practices and ways of coaching and developing people through watching and observing, especially, again, I used to be a professional athlete. So again, there is that physical aspect of it, of watching and observing. And so I'm curious very quickly, because I know we're running out of time shortly, how would my mindset needs to shift when it comes to coaching and developing people? And you've given me 2 great ways and mistakes that I'm more likely to do, and I can see them myself doing them. But how would my behavior and techniques would need to shift for me to be that great coaching leader remotely when I build all my practices and tools, in the office?
First off, I would say don't give up on IRL or in real life interactions. I want to be clear, even remote first and digital first teams and managers should get together in person when it is safe and when it is practical. Being
Hmm.
very strategic about when you get together matters a lot. We're humans, we're relational, communal beings. Let's not try to totally digitize everything. Let's make
Mm,
sure that we make time for getting together and that we really savor it when we get together instead of
yeah.
just passing each other in a hallway and taking it for granted. But the other thing that I would mention more tactically is you have to be super vulnerable as a great remote manager. And you really have to drop your ego and you have to walk into every scenario and ask, what do I not know?
Hmm.
A mentor once shared this to me, and it has really rocked my mind. It is amazing how much we assume in every conversation. We'll hearken back to old experiences and we'll project them forward as if things always will be that way because you've had this one experience that went one way or the other.
Yeah.
Or you'll assume by someone's tone of voice that they're feeling a certain way, or maybe the direction that they're looking, instead of just asking explicitly, what do I not know? What should I know about this situation? Probe and ask questions. It is amazing how far you can get by defusing situations and asking questions instead of walking into a situation and assuming there are certain things that you know and start thrusting that forward.
Mm. As we're going through this conversation, if I was to summarize what I've learned from you here, and the way I now look at remote working is we have to be even more deliberate
Mm.
with our actions and putting our human needs and behaviors first and really zoom into them to
Mm.
incorporate them into our practices a lot more than we did in the past in the office. That's the way of building the trust and processes that people will feel comfortable with and grow within. That's what I've learned from this episode.
It's so well articulated. The key word that we like to use is intention.
Mm,
Remote forces you to be much more intentional about
yes.
almost everything in
Hmm.
management, in business, things that you could take for granted. A lot of the cultural elements of a company, which were established just by the neighborhood that an office was in, for example. When you don't have that, you have to be more intentional about establishing that psychological safety and
Yeah.
establishing that care.
For sure. And the very last question that I always like to wrap up the episode with, and that is, Darren, who is the best coaching leader that you worked for in your career? What
I
made
would
that person?
say, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and what made that person exceptional? Sorry.
I would say Tim Stevens. He was a longtime manager of mine at Engadget. And what made him exceptional is that he was a servant leader. He truly wanted to get to know me, what my goals and ambitions were. And then he tried to create the pathways for that success for me. He
Mm,
tried to set me up for success wherever that next leap was, whether it was with the same company or with another company. His whole
yeah.
goal was to set me up for that next level of success. And so that's what I take away. And Tim Stevens was once called the nicest guy in tech. And I still think that's true.
Wow, incredible. There's something powerful when you look at people and say, hey, how can I help you? So
Mhm.
in 10, 15 years time, when I'm no longer around you, you're still benefiting from my input and I could contribute to your life. And that's when people really follow and resonate with. Incredible leader, Tom Stevens. Amazing guy, sounds like. Okay,
Absolutely.
Dan, thank you so much for this interview. I've learned so much, made so many notes. Incredible one. I'll continue following your work. And guys, please connect with Darren, as he genuinely meant that everything that you do is so transparent
Mm.
that it is just within your PC. You just go, you click, you find out. And again, I'll encourage you guys to go and check at very least his Readme. That will give you the great insight what Darren and GitLab is all about and what direction we should all take when it comes to remote leadership. Thank you very much, Darren.
Thanks, Ralph. And thanks all for tuning in. Be sure to reach out. And if you have any feedback, I'm always open. Thanks all.